last person with you tonight. I first met him sort of in the sweet spot, I suppose, of the Disney organization and the omphalos of the whole place, which sits in the kind of murk of Burbank, just across the freeway from all those sort of huge water steam plants that generate electricity. Very, very unlikely place to find anything other than a cut from Blade Runner. But instead, I sort of wandered into this place which they call the bowling alley. It's in the middle of, really, a bowling alley, so it's a lot like SCI-Arc. They left one lane open so that the employees, if they kind of get a real urge to hurl something, can hurl one of those marble things down the track. Anyway, the bowling alley has been retrofitted with Westinghouse partitions, and there are acres of them. I don't know how many hundred people. It's a maze straight out of Brazil, the movie. And you go back through this totally clean, totally antiseptic, totally controlled hive of illustrators, model makers, project managers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you finally get to the inner sanctum. Well, that's where Chris was holding forth. And to walk into his space is to walk into this completely plastered, completely cockeyed, completely festooned with artifacts, electronics, massive tables, reams of yellow trace everywhere, on the floor, rolling off the table, just completely undecipherable from the rest of the environment. And Chris sits in there with this lunatic grin on his face and says, "Howdy, what are you doing here?" Well, I had two great reels of slides under my arms, and I hesitated to say I wanted him to look at them. And he began to tell me a story. The story took about 3 hours. And in fact, it continued out into the parking lot and continued while we stood there, and he told me about Ferraris and beaches and beach girls and all of those things. And I had by then forgotten completely about the slides. And I think he's still got them. So Chris, please, could I have them back? And will you please tell these people a story to equal the one that we just got?
Thank you. I was down in San Diego over the weekend at the impending School of Architecture there. And I was struck by two things. One, they had an immense budget. And two, they apparently had no students. So and in honor of that, I wore blue jeans and cowboy boots and a sort of rough-hewn leather jacket. And so, by contrast, I decided to dress like a priest tonight. So, it was a bowling alley. There's a correction. There's 4 lanes. They are Westinghouse acreages, but they're laid out according to the King of Spain's grid diagonals at 45 degrees to take advantage of no daylight. And I think it was the Brazil division of Westinghouse that manufactured them. Organizational confines aside, you can always find a way to violate that. And I found that, that swathing myself in yellow trace was a pretty good way to conceal what it was I was doing, but mostly what it was that I wasn't doing, right? Now, the next question is, how in the world does Disney get to SCI-Arc? And I got here because the guy that I work for, who's the administrative head of architecture and engineering, a gentleman by the name of Bill Sims, is a member of the, did you guys build this podium? All right. Is there a light? That's the light. Anyway, Bill agreed to give a lecture here. And he had given a lecture to the American Institute of Architects. And he used, well, you have to understand Bill. He was the head of Air Force Facilities Command, which meant that anything the Air Force needed built, he had to figure out how to get it done, and eventually ran the entire facility structural division for the Air Force, and was a commanding officer, retired. We compared notes on his job and my job and our previous experiences and our current needs. And it turned out that what he had to do for a living while he was in the Air Force was to craft facilities with programs and budgets and schedules and project management issues and all the things that are normally faced by architects and engineers in completing a project without knowing what the completed facility would house until the project was well underway and under construction. And he would then have to hustle to sort of remodel what it was that he'd been building because he'd found out that it was a missile silo or a place to assemble MIRVs or Lord only knows what. And interestingly, that dovetailed straight into Imagineering, because a lot of what we do at Imagineering as architects is find ways to house ideas that are still emerging and to remodel spaces as they're under construction, as the nature of the idea takes place. So how I got here is that Bill had to go over and deal with issues quite similar to what I've just described with Euro Disney's Magic Kingdom, which is currently under construction. It's on schedule, it's on budget, all kinds of neat things like that. But we had agreed to share this lecture in a kind of a Huntley-Brinkley format. And we were going to show some nice, drooly, you know, soft Disney stuff and play When You Wish Upon a Star and show you why the Magic Kingdom is good for you. And then have a discussion afterwards, sort of like reporters. Well, he got called away and left me to my own devices, and I didn't bring his speech. What I thought I'd do is start off by talking about Disney placemaking in a way that connects it more up to the notions of, first, how Disneyland was made, from a very different point of view, not from the usual history of Disneyland, although there's some pretty interesting anecdotes about how it was that Disneyland even happened. Maybe I should tell one. This goes back to Fantasia. And Walt Disney was trying to make a brand new kind of movie, Fantasound, which was a forerunner of stereo music, and a widescreen format, which in 1940, the time that they were composing this particular piece, was totally unheard of in conventional motion picture distribution. Nobody had widescreen movie theaters. They had conventional 2-to-1 formats at the time. So all the artwork, all the movement across the face of the screen, all of the ideas about the art of the film Fantasia were all composed in 70 millimeter or the forerunner of 70 millimeter or Cinerama. And Disney believed that he could put 6 theaters together somewhere in the United States and he could show this movie. Now, taking on a project of this dimension and experimenting as much as they did at the time, and betting everything and borrowing his life insurance and mortgaging his house and doing all the other things that he classically did. He bet his company every time he embarked on a project. He was running out of money. About the same time that World War II had wiped out all of his European distribution, which was a major income generator, and it was what funded these art projects. So he went to the Bank of America, who was his standard banker. They were his financiers. And a senior executive from B of A came down and listened to Disney plead with him about giving him $1 million to finish Fantasia. And the guy said, no, not unless you agree to reformat the movie to go into conventional distribution. And Disney said, no, I'll use my other banker. A bluff that didn't pay off. He didn't have another banker. The Bank of America guy walked down the hall to his brother Roy, and his brother Roy settled the feathers, got them all back down on the body. Fantasia was released in conventional format, and I don't know the truth of this part of the story, but I think the understanding is that Walt never looked at the movie again until he knew he could get it distributed the way it intended. Fortunately, I saw it in 1956 in a phenomenal theater in San Francisco and got the full force of that experience. The result of that, having the banks, having the financiers in direct control of his art, left him in a position where he had to find some other means of producing a reliable stream of income. And that was part of the idea of generating Disneyland. Now, the other piece of that puzzle, of course, the true story, or the other truth in the story, is that he was playing in the backyard of his home up on Carrollwood with trains that were big enough to put all of his friends, including Salvador Dali and Ward Kimball and other, equally even-tempered folks on board, and driving them around through the hills of Beverly very early on. So that was the forerunner of the steam train that ran all the way around the park. And he had all these movies that he didn't know what to do with. He wanted to extend their life. He wanted to extend the life of the characters. But mostly he found that there was no good place where he could go with his daughters and enjoy an afternoon or an entire day together, unless he went to an amusement park, which everybody knows were characterized as dirty and full of criminals, guys out on leave, etc. Or going down to what is now the Beverly Center, where they had a pony ride. Things don't change much in some instances, Still no place to go and sit with your kids. So he decided to come up with a place that was for families. And that had a profound effect, a profound impact on what Disneyland became as a place. Because by defining the smallest component of scale, a classic 1950s family, mom, dad, 2 children, or 2.5, depending upon how you want to read the statistics, that meant that everything was scaled and proportioned to be viewed by 4- and 5-year-olds, infants, 4- and 5-year-olds, up through relatively young children who are starting to, understand and read stories on their own, along with the adults and the grandparents. But it meant that every time you sat down on a ride, they'd be 4 abreast, so that the family unit would share in the experience. It also started to work into path width. It worked into the scale of Main Street. These things all coupled together in Disney placemaking. So essentially, in making Disneyland, the architects and the engineers and the scenographers that had come from motion pictures and artists who had come from the animation side of all of that same imagery were involved with sight and space. They dealt with themes. They dealt with analog and allegory. They dealt with myths. They dealt with metaphor. They dealt with the movies and with literature. And they did all these things sort of in simultaneity. And they composed Disneyland in a storyboard sequence, believing in the possibility of the movement of the camera, but replacing the camera with a visitor, with the guest, so that things were seen in sequence, cinegraphically, in a way that you moved from point A to point B to point C, and you read each story point along the way. Now, in order to do this, they had to come up with some narrative transformation of all those pieces of place writing, like playwriting, and they created a narrative structure for Disneyland. Disneyland, of course, was first organized in the early 1950s as we, as a country, moved away from cities and into suburbs, learned how to communicate via bumper stickers rather than in cafes and post offices and things like that. Our mobility was substantially increased because of the incredible availability of the automobile and cheap fuel. Free time increased immensely, so people had a place that they needed to go and no place to receive them. They had a need to escape the suburbs because it was pretty droll and dull to live there. We were investing in the future for the first time. Emotionally, we were investing in the future because we were, for the first time, in a way that we could believe that we could actually leave the planet. So with all that stuff sort of swirling around, Disneyland was crafted to keep you tied to some of the basic values of family life, where Main Street was home. The hub at Disneyland, which is at the end of the Main Street, presents the other places of Disneyland as a central park, each place showing only a doorway of itself. Tomorrowland, of course, the doorway to Tomorrowland is just to present the coming lifestyles, to present space and outer space, to show what your place in the future might be. There was even a house of the future that had been crafted with the help of Monsanto. This was a house that contained not one scrap of organic material, but it did have microwave ovens and ultrasonic cleaners and things of that sort. And that's funny, when they went to tear down the House of the Future, they got a big wrecking ball out there and a bunch of bulldozers, and they took a whack at it, and they couldn't budge it. They eventually had to cut it apart. So those of you who are worried about your Corvettes and your insurance rates, something to be said about the strength of fiberglass, I guess. In Fantasyland, you could enter the worlds of myth and fairy tales, and you could relive early moments from your own childhood. For the first time, you were gaining a coupling of literature and image and place. In Frontierland, you could visit America's recent pioneer and expansionist past. And at Adventureland, you could go to far-off places, the exotic world. But throughout Disneyland, even the day it opened, the production values ran so deep because I think the instinct at the time that the place was being made was that they had to create enough layers of memory so that the places could be read quickly. And after all, you only had a day to see and do it all. Disneyland closed at midnight. You couldn't live there. So it had to have enough depth of memory that that family that was visiting could share something deeper than just going on rides and attractions. There was more to it than sitting on a bench while the kids went on a pony ride. Now there was a way that the parents and the children, the grandparents could all interact. The place provided a means by which they could interact. The grandparents could recall and tell about Main Street because that was still part of their today, and it was a recently and fondly remembered past, and they could reminisce about that. Children themselves could recall and live out brief fantasies within fairy tales in Fantasyland. Television shows such as Davy Crockett, Zorro, and the Swamp Fox coincided with Frontierland. Adventureland was derived from the True Life Adventures, so all this media product already existed. It was already part of the ether. So Disneyland as a place was extended into your living rooms via the new media of television, and was broadcast. It's very important that it was broadcast and not narrowcast in the way cable is today. So the selectivity was much, much, much broader and much more focused towards presenting Disneyland as an event. It was marketed via television. It was explained. And when you arrived at Disneyland, the place, in the 1950s and the 1960s, you already knew a great deal about how to use it because television had presented it to you weekly in a Disneyland show. Disneyland used to start off, the show used to start off with Walt sitting in his office, and he'd say, and this week's story comes to you from Adventureland. And the logo of Adventureland would go up on screen, and that same logo was recalled in the gateway to Adventureland when you got to the real place. So he already knew what was going to happen to you. The extraordinary thing is that Disneyland became a product that could be improved, it could be expanded, the ideas of that product could be stretched to suit the needs of the marketplace, and finally, that product could be exported. Now, in explaining a product, for example, over the weekend, Jerry from Nissan International was explaining that what Nissan International did with the automobile product was that they began seeing it as an object for consumption that just happened to be transportation. That reoriented automobile design, at least for that manufacturer, into a product-driven mode. Disneyland is also a product, and it's not just architecture or urban planning or infrastructure or the rides or the entertainment or even the cutting-edge media technologies that are explored there, kind of in a recall of the failure of Disney to get Fantasia out on screen in that wide format. In the same way that nowadays we have IMAX theaters and Omnisphere theaters that are exploring the edges of film media in a way that you're not going to get in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of motion picture theaters throughout the United States where the conventional product is distributed. Imagine seeing Terminator 2 on an Omni screen, for example, and being in the midst of that whole environment. There's a portent of things to come there. So Disneyland presents some of that in its setting. So Disneyland really is a sum of parts that generate a product. It's called Disneyland, and it's just as surely a sum of parts of any product specifically designed as such. And when you start to break it down to individual components, you no longer have Disneyland, you only have the pieces of it. So those who seek to understand the individual bits of Disneyland and use them in creating shopping malls and water parks and, in fact, other theme parks, don't have the corporate will and they don't have the experience in making product like Disneyland that Imagineering has. So there are other major projects that the Disney company has produced since Disneyland. They're extensions of the same concepts about place and about placemaking, except that the newest parks are driven either by Disneyland itself as the familiar narrative, or or extensions and retellings of that place. Tokyo Disneyland is an utterly exotic export from the United States into Japan. And not one component of that integrated product idea is transformed in deference to the local audience, to the Japanese audience. In fact, the very essence of its success is that it's an exportation of exotic storytelling into a fairly inward and introspective culture that's only just within the last 40 or 50 years willing to reach out into an international marketplace. The Magic Kingdom in Florida is quite different from Disneyland here because it's part of a much bigger system, and it was intended to be the founding component of an entire urban or suburban construct that was unique to Disney's visions of an experimental community. The Magic Kingdom that's being built in Europe is a very difficult product problem, because in taking all of the classic and traditional fairy tales and related stories that are composed of Disneyland here in the United States, the charm, the old world craft, the ideas of Fantasyland, those wonderful little Cotswold cottages and things like that, and setting it down in France where, within a 2-hour drive of Paris, you can see everything, it became a very difficult problem. What we finally settled on doing was to take all of Disneyland and extrude it through a retelling of those stories as even greater and more powerful fantasies and myths than are available in the countryside, a kind of a decoding of European culture in a Disneyesque sort of way. By the way, it's creatively, I think it's about 2.5 Disneylands in terms of its intensity. It's going to be just utterly powerful. It's going to be a fabulous place. And there's not one square inch of it that isn't themed. You knew I'd get to that, right? But there's other sources of images and place concepts that have been used to make Disney places. The movies, World's Fairs, boardwalks, studios, industrial remnants. We touch for a minute on Epcot Center, for example. Gideon predicted in a series of lectures that were given at the Metropolitan Museum in the late 50s that the ancient heroic monuments, those cosmic sculptures that were built 5,000 years ago, and the capture of interior space, those first dark and cavernous and then brilliantly illuminated cathedrals and temples, could be merged into cosmic sculpture with equally cosmic interiors. And regardless of the subject matter of the individual pavilions at Epcot Center's future world, each place nevertheless achieved the prediction in some way. And whether or not you agree that Gideon's projection was appropriate or even meaningful as a future world, there is a piece of architectural theory and architectural history encapsulated where the merging of object, space, and the means to experience both of those simultaneously, the rides, touch on some of, and then they touch on some of the meanings that were sort of inherent in his book, The Beginnings of Architecture, The Eternal Present. For example, if you think some of the ride environments and the space and place relationships, for those of you who've been to Epcot, and I'll describe some of them very briefly for those who haven't. Spaceship Earth is a sphere, it's a geosphere. The ride is a spiral up into a planetarium and back down again. The story that's being told is a narrative by Walter Cronkite of the history of communications. Of course, it's presented by American Telephone and Telegraph Company. The Living Seas, you step into a hydrolator, an elevator that's purportedly prepared to take you under the sea. You drop all of the 1/2 of an inch, but through special effects, physical special effects, not just motion picture effects, we're trying to create the suspension of disbelief that puts you in an undersea laboratory. In energy, presented by Exxon, regardless of the corporate presenter, the ride is pretty interesting because you step into and take your place in a 600-seat theater that then completely revolves with a 360-degree motion picture taking place around you. A mirrored wall then opens, and the theater divides up into 6 100-seat theaters, mini theaters, that then travel through Dante's Inferno, inhabited by dinosaurs. This, of course, explaining where gas comes from. And then you recouple, and you can laugh if some of this strikes you as fanciful and funny. But then it reassembles at the end back into that 600-seat theater again and revolves again. So just very interestingly, I think Michael Eisner was talking in a meeting a few weeks ago about how to get some kind of a ride going that created the sense of awe that the energy ride created. Just the mere act of fragmenting an audience and reassembling it and rotating it again, just the physical brilliance of that. He said, regardless of what was being shown on the screen surrounding you, regardless of the story that was being told, that act of transformation was so extraordinary that what you just went through had to be good. The Horizons Pavilion, which is kind of an extrapolation of the old Carousel of Progress, where we saw how that was kind of a sexist experience, actually. I think it involved how kitchen appliances were going to make mom's life easier. And they had this great little jingle, you know, about how it's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow. And that all began at the World's Fair in '64 in New York City. Horizons is just an extrusion of that same concept using much more novel vehicle technology, ride experience technology, where we convey you sideways through a series of environments, eventually concluding in a double Omnimax screen that puts you right in the middle of a space shuttle launch. And it's pretty compelling as a visual experience. Then you come back down out of that, and at the end of the whole thing, through technology, the kind of technology that was available to us in 1979, 1980, we give you the opportunity to choose an environment to go to at the conclusion of the ride. I think there's 3 different places you can go: an undersea realm, a space realm, and a sort of a mechanized farming realm. And we're even able to waft into your olfactory nerve the scent of fresh oranges. So that was that notion of smell-o-vision, you know, that some guys were experimenting with the movies in. The Land Pavilion, where you go on a boat cruise through a series of agrarian environments and actually go out into an experimental crop environment where things are being grown hydroponically and et cetera. And in fact, the chief advisor in that project wound up being the chief engineer for the botanical and related systems for Biosphere 2, which was just closed in Arizona. Dr. Carl Hodgetts from the University of Arizona in Tucson, who is the gentleman that runs the environmental research laboratory there. The Wonders of Life, which has a sort of a health and fitness playground and a simulator ride that, once the audience has been miniaturized to 42 people, explore a white and red corpuscle battle within the body. Transportation, which is probably the least intriguing, in that you're strapped in a vehicle while Gary Owens lulls you with a little ditty about it's fun to be free as you drive past only automobiles as the future of transportation. But Epcot Center and Future World is notable because it does fix a place in time, and it's undeniably a unique place on the planet that explores a series of ideas that are brought to you by the fairly large corporate domain of the United States, but nevertheless does it in a spatial and placemaking novelty. Walt Disney World, of course, began because Walt Disney cooked up this idea of Epcot. Not Epcot Center, but Epcot, the experimental prototype community. And the film that he made was used to convince the state of Florida to grant him and his company a legislative enablement or entitlement, which is something, you know, we all fight for as architects, is to get the entitlement to remodel the building down the street that's, you know, slightly miszoned or something like that. Well, here he was trying to get 27,000 acres to be identified as an area where he could self-govern, where he had his own tax collecting system, where he had his own community, where he had his own building department, where in fact he had his own building codes. And so Walt Disney World, everything at Walt Disney World is constructed under the Epcot Code. And the Epcot Code is a performance code, not a prescriptive code. So rather than applying limitations to how we build, it provides an encouragement to explore new ways to construct buildings, new ways to use materials and technology. You can imagine what kind of an opportunity that presents what kind of a blank sheet of paper that presents to an architect or similar design professional who's come from some other background, i.e., the conventional practice, where instead of having to fight with the guys down at Plan Check, what you're doing is working with code engineers who are forming new code structures that eventually be placed by the ICBO into the prescriptive codes that are used to govern building throughout the United States. In fact, a lot of Epcot happened at Walt Disney World. The Utili Doors, for those of you who don't know what those are, all the utilities are placed in open tunnels that exist beneath the streets of the Magic Kingdom. Cogeneration plants, so that solid waste, and which was delivered to the cogeneration plant via vacuum-driven solid waste tubes. So you dumped all of the paper trash and things like that into vacuum containers, and it would be whisked away to a cogeneration plant that produced electricity that was hooked into the Florida power grid. A water hyacinth waste treatment facility, so that all the sewage went into water hyacinth ponds. The water hyacinths grew on the organics. The wastewater that was then delivered as secondary treated material went back out into the Reedy Creek system. It was actually environmentally appropriate. This was all done in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And of course, the experimental systems in the entertainment media, the use of all of the cutting-edge entertainment systems involving space and time and place transformations. An extraordinary example of an invisible entertainment medium that behaves in a way completely unexpected is the American Adventure. Delicious, patriotic play. Takes you on a sort of a brief history of how America, the nation, was formed, hosted by Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Mark Twain. They're audio animatronic figures, which are those fabulous robots that we've produced, that most of you know from the Pirates of the Caribbean, where the one guy is auctioning that bevy of girls. I wonder if we could design that today and get away with it as family entertainment. Well, so long as we have our own government, I think we can probably get away with it for a while longer at least. The intriguing thing about the American Adventure is that it's a play performed behind a proscenium arch on a conventional stage to the appearances of the 1,500 people in the audience who sit in a classic continental seated theater. In fact, what's taking place is that there's an immense 90-ton theatrical wagon that rolls beneath you, the audience, that contains each of these performers and the tableaus in which they interact with the other performers. It contains them in a series of platforms and cages on hydraulic lifts. And this whole sequence performs at 99+% accuracy and efficiency, and it does it every 20 minutes. We also couple rear projection and front projection and scrims and all of the array of theatrical devices that are available to us, but there's not one live performer, and yet everybody comes on stage at cue and interacts and carries through this performance. The Disney MGM Studios, the newest theme park at Walt Disney World, is a workplace exhibition. It's a theme park about the movies, but it's a movie factory about theme parks. So it's starting to couple two important ideas for the first time. Each Disney park so far has been a specialty new town, each with specialized functions and very specialized means in which to serve the needs of that town's population. Population, which, by the way, changes every day. So, how do we do all this? I mean, I've got some slides. It's not all just going to be talk here. But I wanted to context one set of ideas by giving you a background on how some of these pieces might fit together. What we do is we use a narrative form. We use that to commence the design of the completed place, but the narrative style varies widely in application. At Disneyland, the narrative form is to create that group of lands. At Future World, in the World Showcase at Epcot, the narrative form was fairly simple. It was an exploration of world cultures and American industry and how they could coexist in a future economic dynamic somewhere on the planet. The Studio Tour, which is a workplace, Typhoon Lagoon, which is a water park, and Pleasure Island. Now, what I brought is some slides to make a case for Disney placemaking. that's a little separated from the traditional theme parks. And in that Pleasure Island was specifically designed as a nightlife center for Walt Disney World. So first, you need to consider what the objective was for Pleasure Island, nightlife for grown-ups. Contrasted to the structured parks, we had to craft a different sequence of events to be encountered in yet a familiar setting. So the most familiar setting at Pleasure Island is the merging of the idea of Main Street and the Paseo, the Mediterranean tradition of the nightly stroll. We located Pleasure Island at the edge of Walt Disney World, in fact, in an area that some of us characterized as a border town. So for a while we thought, well, if it's a border town, we could have demolition derby and figure eight racing, and we could do things that you don't do inside the theme parks. More importantly, we projected what the population would be at the place, who the guests would be, and what they would be after. We figured out there would be a mix of locals, the townies, and the tourists or the visitors. So somewhat like Breaking Away, we had the guys that wanted to go swim in the rock quarry, and then we had the people that were there for their structured educations or whatever. But it had to be equally accessible to the locals and to the tourist, and it had to be interesting enough, and it had to have enough layers of memory so that tourists away from home, long way from home, would feel comfortable going out at night, going to bars and nightclubs, which have a vitality and have a sort of a microculture of their own. And any of you who've walked into a local neighborhood bar in a town that you've never been to before, without anybody who has entree to that bar, knows how unfriendly a place like that can seem if you're not a local. I wanted to sort of this is a really off-the-wall moment, but there's the idea of themes at Disney projects, and the idea of using the narratives to form these themes. Tony Baxter, who's a senior vice president and chief designer for half of the portfolio of the work of Imagineering, who's mostly responsible for extending the Disneyland concept and the Epcot concepts, likes to talk about piling up marshmallows. This logic goes something like this, that if you get one bag of marshmallows and set them out in a field, that's interesting, but it's not an attraction. But if you pile enough marshmallows up in one place, people will come to it just to stand and look at the pile of marshmallows and say, my God, look at that immense pile of marshmallows. Well, in a kind of a subtle way, that all of that story structure that's built into the place of Disneyland, all those little visual cues, all those Corinthian capitals that when you get up close turn out to be 6 little squirrels winking at you, all those little pieces of iconography that are part of the decorative system that overlays the basic construct that's Disneyland, is sort of like piling up marshmallows. If you pile enough of it in one place, you get this rich, deep melange of production value that becomes so memorable that you sort of have to keep going back to it. So we use a sort of a much better narrative form to start the place writing. And I'm going to take you through one of those and then look at the process of design a little bit and watch a place undergo the craftsmanship of making it. So we're not just going to have some graphics and then some finished product. What we're going to have is the most powerful act of placemaking, which is the construction and the importance of carrying the narrative not just through the design phase, but to carry it out into the field and to take that same story and the same ideas right down to the construction level and to get the construction workers as deeply involved in this myth as you were when you started to design it. And then we'll enjoy the finished product a little bit, and at any moment along the way, if anybody wants to sort of shout out and create some lecturely abrasion, it's more than welcome. You got it. Are these side by side or? Pardon? One after the other. Wrong tray. Is that tray 2? put up tray 1. No? There should be one that comes up with a title at slide 1. We're not doing well. No? No, I really want to get to the beginning. There we go. All right, other projector off, please. Yeah, and that's sweet. Pleasure Island. Well, okay. Now, the way we start this off, see, is that we discovered there was this guy named Meriwether Pleasure. I swear to you guys are going to love this. He bought this island down in Central Florida. He was in the canvas manufacturing business, but that wasn't going well where he was located in Pittsburgh, so he moved down to Florida. But he did very well at it, and he managed to actually construct some additions to this island back in the 20s. They actually had color photography then. And created a manufacturing district where they worked on ship chandlery and manufacturing sales and things of that sort. And he began to dabble in a whole series of enterprises, eventually crafting a series of warehouses. And you probably recognize this as one of the buildings from SCI-Arc. And eventually wound up with this industrial island. But in 1941, when he was trying to circumnavigate Antarctica, he was pitch-poled in a storm and was lost. And the island fell into the hands of his ne'er-do-well sons. This was the island, part of the island. This was a club that he established for his friends in the yachting business. And they used to come and hang out at this place, the little spa that they had downstairs. What happened actually was that he got involved in a game of dominoes at the École des Beaux-Arts, the 5th arrondissement, with Sir Edwin Lutyens and Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and won the game of dominoes, and they were forced into a joint venture and had to design this club for him so that he could put all the artifacts that he collected on a series of around-the-world voyages. Now, those of you who know dominoes will understand that if you follow the ornament, it plays out that game in dominoes. Eventually, however, he closed his doors to the public and began experimenting with things like amphibious flying wings and etc. But as I said, the business fell into the hands of his ne'er-do-well sons right after this explosion. And that's Henry and Stuart in the back. And after the war, they continued in the business, collecting artifacts and cataloging them. This was one that they still haven't reconstructed, but they liked it. They traveled to other places around the world to sort of gather up ideas for how they could continue the island, and some more artifacts. Dead slide. This is great. Also, collecting up ideas about places, until finally they ran the business into bankruptcy, and it was left in unsaleable shambles. Just before the creditors' sale, the creditors lived in these fancy houses in the Mediterranean, by the way, and looked like this. Right? The island was left in unsaleable shambles because a hurricane had rushed through. Now, what's fun about this photograph is this is not some stuff I pulled from the archives. This is the project under construction. So the myth of the collapsed warehouse district became the reality of how we completed the project. It looks like a hurricane hit it, doesn't it? What we were trying to do is create nightlife. We were trying to wind up with an event like this. And the way we did it was pretty conventional. Another bad slide. I promise if I'm ever invited back, I'll put them in glass. Can we go? Let's go to the next one. Having crafted this whole myth, we came up with the idea that there was this abandoned warehouse district that needed to be remodeled. So the program, the space program, all of the events, all of the pieces of this puzzle were fitted together as a part of this narrative. And in order to do that, well, we went back to our sketchbooks and looked at things about streets and about places and about the urban sequence that we wanted to achieve and how we wanted to engage all the clubs together into that kind of a setting. And what we came up with was the very hyperactive streets that are used in Paseo and Passeggiata on the nightly strolls that occur in the Mediterranean, so that the population that came to Pleasure Island every night got involved in a street scene and street activity. And rather than what we have at Disneyland, where you start down at the main entrance and walk up Main Street, and you don't come back through or use Main Street until the end of the day, what we did was we put a node of activity, something important to get to at each end of this street, and then arrayed the whole thing on an island, and did some illustrations to just sort of get a feel for what the finished place might be like. Actually looked at the whole of this as an island from across water. We really did a site plan and got to thinking about what it would be. The way we made the island was to just take an edge of land that was sitting in an existing lake and carved a canal across one side and then dotted in a whole series of industrial vernacular buildings, and then tried to find a way in each of these buildings to craft the paths of movement and the way they would be used so that each would serve as a club that had a very specific focus in terms of its audience. This is a later version where Pleasure Island to the upper left was coupled into the existing Walt Disney World Village, which is done in sort of 60s diagonal siding go-away roof line. So you really can't see the place for all the trees. So we just fit this island off to the edge. The steamboat was there from an earlier craft, from an earlier project. In fact, doesn't go anywhere. But what we wanted to do was sort of create this center spine that dissolved into a couple of nightclubs at one end and then up into a plaza or square and fronted by 3 more nightclubs at the other end, and to come into it on kind of a T intersection from the middle bridge. Another bad slide. Wow. He's worked in San Diego, Craig.
Big budget.
Big budget? Yeah. That's right. That's a good one. Having done the illustrations and having done some architectural design, etc., I'm not going to show you those kinds of graphics because you can understand what they probably look like. We started crafting a fairly detailed model of all of this stuff. The first one I just showed you was a comedy warehouse. This is a building that wound up being called the Zephyr Rock and Rollodrome. And we wanted to do a couple of simple things here, combine roller skating, bars, discotheque dancing, and a restaurant. And the way we were going to operate it was to have somebody at the center of all of this that was a host. And I'll show you how we pulled that off in a minute. Took a look at the island from the outer edge. Again, very, very literal in the industrial vernacular. But what we were looking for was an enclosure that could house theatrical events as compared to ride attractions, which you'd see at Disneyland. So each of these pieces had a place in that fabricated history of Pleasure Island, and then each of them became transformed through the making of nightclubs and restaurants. So as you look down on the island here, the thing in the foreground is the Empress Lily. That's a restaurant. The awning stripes is an Italian restaurant. The green building with the little dormer windows is Fireworks Factory, which is a barbecue restaurant in which the ruins of Pleasure's fireworks factory have exploded and been left as artifact. The Zephyr Rock and Rollodrome, which finally sort of took on a configuration like a sailing vessel, or like a big ship, and it sat out at the water's edge on stilts. The little red building was Madison's Dive, which was a sort of a rough bar with a portrait of Madison the Mermaid from Splash, because this was designed contemporaneously with that movie. And then all the other objects up at the other end. The other interesting thing we did is we created an uphill street that changed scale by about 20 feet as you went uphill. Then we do these lush renderings because we've got to go market this to people who are going to believe in it enough to give us the budget and turn us loose and let us build it. And then we start working with show designers. And these are the people at Imagineering who concern themselves specifically with event and with characters. So they start looking at what the underlying theatrical character of each of the places might be. The comedy club. Model makers then go inside and start looking at how that theatrical space might work physically, and how we may want to get the people who work on stage to move off stage, climb stairs and ladders, and get into a position where they're part of the audience. Because we wanted to do some confrontational humor here, rather than just have people do stand-up. This is that same space being finished up, and we used some pretty interesting material to pull it all off. The treads and risers and the drink ledges are all made out of checker plate, just like you get off the back end of your pickup truck. We also do this kind of artwork, which becomes the finished artwork that's inside the club that sort of sets the tone for what you're going to get. Right? And for the environmentalists, right? This was the Adventurers Club, and the first notions of the Adventurers Club was that it involved world exploration, and it brought back, the world exploration brought back artifacts which were all collected up into this place that Edwin Lutyens and McIntosh had designed. This was a mask room, and all the masks on the wall are animated, and in the finished place, that's what happened. This is the rotunda of that same space, the first illustrations of it. Then a more refined rendering that begins to look at some more of the detail and begins to give us clues as to what we're going to have to do as we achieve the interior of it. And then this is a view of the completed space. It's a 60-foot tall octagonal rotunda, and the entrance to it is on the upper level. If you look on the bottom right side, you see a little British colonel sitting in a niche. His story is that he was struck by a curse in India and confined to this cabinet. What he actually does is talk to the audience. The trick that we've got here is that he's not audio animatronic, he's a puppet. So one of the live performers who works in this nightclub engages in a nightly repartee with members of the audience. It's pretty convincing, the way it all sort of interacts. The artifacts are genuine. They took about 4 years to collect, and as you can see, they totally overwhelm the space. And they so implode on you that this sort of is the marshmallow theory taken to its extreme. Right? There's one of the marshmallows. This is a back bar. This is an illusion. That's a magic lantern that floats inside that cabinet. This is the ship in the bottle behind the bar, except that it's struck by a storm and sinks. Right? This is an idea for the Zephyr Rock and Rollodrome. And the notion here was that it took all the music took a variety of forms, and that the only way you could cement it all together was to have a disc jockey in a flying vehicle. In fact, that flying vehicle wound up being something like a pulpit, and the space wound up being crafted rather like a Romanesque cathedral, with a center aisle and side aisles. And the way he was moved around in the space was from an industrial bridge crane. In order to understand how all that would work in life size and to see if we sort of got it figured out, we built some very detailed and sort of lush 1-inch models of all of it. And we test each end of the space and try and understand what happens as all that space interleaves. The ground floor is dancing. The mid-level is roller skating. So the idea is that there were sort of 3 kinds of animation all engaged into one room. It's a view from above. This is an idea for a club that's since become named Cage. We started off calling it Videopolis, City of Video. The notion here was that it was a cave-like space composed entirely of video screens. The only illumination in the space would come from video, and the surfaces were deliberately painted out flat black, regardless of what they were made of, so that the source of light would only be video and reflection off of people's clothing, faces. And finally, we gave up and made the dance floor out of stainless steel so that we could get some of the video imagery to play off of the floor. In order to pull all this off, this was the idea, by the way, in that same space a little bit earlier, where we were going to have a video nerd that ran the whole thing. One of those guys that sits up all night and plays with 150 Macintoshes and tries to see how many images he can project. What that merged into was an idea for a game that would be played on each of the video screens in the club. There were 6 screens where you could play a game, and if you won the game, you could take control of all the image. We actually did that, using HyperCard as the structure of the game. Early models for that same space, and then some very detailed production models to begin to understand how we would suspend all this video and how we would convey the signals to all of those instruments. And we finally decided that we probably ought to express the transformation of the signal from one component to the next with these tubes, light pipes, if you will. It only took a small wire to move the images around, but we decided to express it with some great big tubes, and these are our sort of leftovers from all those times when you tried to get your dryer to work and you worked with that weird aluminum tubing. Once we had all this tubing into place, we couldn't see it, so we decided to throw a laser light off all of it. So now what we have is video image, laser light crashing off all of this. And then we decided we needed an environment, some kind of an aura to play all that against. So we introduced smoke into the space as well. This is the finished club. I think we pulled off that first image. I think we got it to happen. This club plays alternative rock and roll music. It's not mainstream disco. So it's sort of video dada, okay? This was an idea for the largest and most important club on the island, and we used as the beginning cue costumed theatrical mannequins. We decided to make all these mute performers climb through the rigging of a theater. As a visitor to this nightclub, you enter on an elevator and are carried up to the third level in the catwalks of the theatrical rigging. We've got 26 active lines of scenery that are in a state that are all automated and run off of a video board, so that we can constantly transform the nature of the space, both in terms of theme, image, and containment. The mannequins include Marilyn's and the traditional Japanese kabuki performance, costume drama, and they're suspended all throughout this space, engaged into a proscenium arch, hanging on trapezes, literally climbing off the walls. The idea of the club for the visitor is that you go from being off stage to being on stage in a circling progression. You enter from above and you cascade down through a series of passageways, staircases, experiencing the structure the whole way, moving through a sequence of ever larger and more complicated spaces, affording more and more views of the main performance area, which in fact is a turntable. Dance floor is a 60-foot diameter theatrical turntable, and it gives us the ability to take the visitor to the club and, by moving the turntable, completely change the social dynamic that has set place on the dance floor, so that members of the audience are at once performers and the observed. Here's one of the bars within that club with the mannequins engaged into the space as members of the cast. Contrary to a lot of Disney work, the idea at Pleasure Island was to celebrate the structure, and we got into it in a big way. Supporting 26 active lines of mechanized scenery requires some pretty massive structures, and since we didn't have the conventional theatrical components of thrust blocks and big bearing walls to pull it all off of, we wound up taking all the forces, pulling it through all of this structure. So the structure actually was one of the main ingredients in finally configuring the whole of the space. Eventually, this became embellished with mannequins and with all the light show instruments. There's the turntable in fabrication. You can see the proscenium arch behind, and this is one of the vantage points from within the nightclub. So there's a second level that completely surrounds that dance floor so that you can get up, get out of the action, choose where you want to wade into it again, and then dive back down into it. The club has turned out to be an extraordinary success. And I think that's that first set of slides. Is tray 2 ready? There we go. All right, now, what we're going to do here is just watch the place get built a little bit. We're going to talk about just a few of the little elements in it. That, again, is the Zephyr Rock and Rollodrome, but now what we're doing is we're saying we want to enter it on the third level. We want to use that structure that you see laying against the building as a gangway, so there's a recollection of going aboard ship. It has an immense glazed wall that faces to the south. That's 2 layers of green-tinted glazing, and the water that forms a reflector. And in the daytime, the interior of this space is imbued with an aquamarine daylight that uplights the undersurface of all the floors, which are done in white corrugated perforated metal that conceal conceal night lighting sequences. So the whole idea of the interior of this was that it was utterly weightless and could be constantly transformed by light. Here we are looking at structure again within the Mannequin Club. This is another proscenium arch that we built on the island. It's the remnants of an industrial object that's being used to form the gateway into the central passage in the project, so that going to the island to join in the action, you literally have to walk through a proscenium arch or go on stage. The next piece of the puzzle was sorting out where the paths would be, where the streets would be, how all that would work together. And rather than predefine all of that in terms of how people would move, and even though we have very reliable industrial engineering and all that sort of business and sort of a lot of experience in how people move, what we did here is we watched how construction moved all around the site. And we decided to craft all of the paths and open space to respond to what the natural movement was once the objects had taken enough shape to move around on it. We began also looking at the in-betweens, the spaces in between the buildings, because the most important nightclub at Pleasure Island is the street and the leftover spaces off to either side. Each of the clubs themselves were very focused anterooms or lounges that occurred off of the street, and the most powerful night clubbing occurs in the street itself. In fact, we went to the state of Florida and got a liquor license for the whole island. The Mannequin Club being built. That's more of the architecture of the gangway that leads up into the Zephyr. We weren't afraid to mix up a lot of the architectural ideas and do some stuff that you're not used to seeing at Disney. I'm proud to say there's not one piece of glass fiber reinforced plastic ornament here. It's all built out of real construction, and that it's built in a realistic way. The scale is realistic. There's no forced perspective. There's no downsizing of components in the street. And some of these high places are there so that people can climb up into them in the same way that they climb up into the campaniles and the towers of traditional, well-organized little villages. Here we are building the turntable again. You're beginning to get an idea of what the lighting effect might tend to be like inside that space. Here's that street taking shape again. Here's some vistas and nooks and crannies. The idea of the place where off to the edges are these sort of dark side of the industrial district realms. This is looking back out across the island from the water. That repeats that model view that we were looking at earlier. The other thing we do, of course, we have Disney, we got pretty big budgets, so we have an opportunity to bring some instant landscape into play. Great history on this tree. 25 years ago, it was planted on Lake Buena Vista Boulevard, and when they decided to widen that street, we took all the trees. We moved 6 80-ton oaks in one night. That's the Adventurers Club. These are the bridges going out on the island. Now, for the first time, you're seeing all the patina of age being drawn onto the surfaces of the buildings, so that we're starting to throw them back in time and give this place a history, so that the oldest buildings have a layer of memory inserted in them through very traditional Disney graining and texturing. This is the island looking from the westernmost end. By the way, we also built an AMC 10 theater right across from Pleasure Island, and I convinced AMC to get hooked up in the mythology, and they wrote their own myth, and the AMC theater, which is now their flagship in the southeast, is all crafted out of the same business as Pleasure Island. There's all kinds of withered facades and chunks falling off, etc. That building is a country western club. Please don't tell the country western guys that. This is the Adventurers Club as we delivered it. And since it's a border town, the guys from Tijuana got here and junked it up, which is the other nice thing about this project, is that it has the same vitality the little town or little community would have, that when one thing doesn't work, another entrepreneur can come in and change it. So this guy felt he had to put a sign on it, put some old junk out in front, so he'd get people to cross that threshold and go in and sit in the nightclub. This is up in the air, starting to see what that street texture finally wound up being. That's the Country Western Club. It's called the Neon Armadillo. The theme is decidedly country western. There's a little clue for Los Angeles, Chandler Row. That's Raymond Chandler, who sort of dealt with the dark side of Los Angeles. The street's all made out of paper blocks and stuff like that. This ain't Main Street by any stretch. I don't know if any of you remember your physics in the second law of thermodynamics. Well, that's Robert Maxwell's demon there as a locomotive. You can go back and dig in your encyclopedias. That's the Comedy Warehouse, now festooned with all of the junk that you have to put on a building like this to perform nightly fireworks shows. There's that proscenium arch scene as you enter the island. And so the Zephyr actually became a radio station, and just above where it says tickets in that little penthouse up there, we installed a working FM station, a local FM radio station. This is the inside of the Country Western nightclub, calfskin tabletops, lots of glass. This is some of the ornament of Pleasure Island. It's just industrial construction detail. And this is shown off, it's celebrated. We're not trying to cover it up. We try to be very honest about all these pieces. This was a great moment. This was the first time the lights went on at night. And what we tried to do was create this sort of somber, slightly dangerous warehouse night scene. It worked very well. There's that tower all lit up like a gantry, like something straight out of what Craig described as the vicinity where I work. An aerial. And the big splashy Disney photograph from the end. That's the slides. Now, has everybody had it? You want to go home? You can go home, right? Sure. I don't know if this is any help at all. But it's a different way to go at it. So, yes?
Why would you want to artificially recreate culture and social spaces? I mean, ultimately probably an absurdity. I mean, take for a model something like Westwood Village.
Can you yell?
Westwood Village sort of developed over time, right?
Yeah.
Culture and spaces. What you're doing here, I mean, it's not profound. I mean, planners do it all the time. They create focal points in certain areas of theater, etc. And what you've done, I mean, you're talking about, well, this is where the country western person is, this is where that goes. I mean, I guess for what you would call common everyday person, you keep on mentioning this word honesty. I'm not sure if this place is at all honest. I mean, it's like you're honestly trying to recreate this artificial environment that you enjoy.
Yeah.
I mean, what?
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I don't. I'm not going to stand up here and say that that this project or any other project that we do as a company, is changing the real world. It's not going to provide a source to restore Hollywood Boulevard, for example. What it might be, is just a furthering of escapist fantasy that's not that much different from sitting in front of your cable television and changing channels, etc. What we're doing is at least creating a construct where social interaction that has some structure to it can take place that represents and implies threat but lets you out of it safely.
So that's the whole notion. You go to this theme park because it's safe. I mean, typically, like,
Absolutely you go to it because it's safe.
Usually events happen spontaneously, and here it's completely contrived.
Yeah, it's the events that happen here are definitely contrived. They're definitely controlled. But my job, I don't know. I said my job is not to necessarily to figure out if this is socially right, in the age when, Marxist economics aren't working anymore, In the end, what I'm supposed to do is create entertainment. So, you can ask the question in a broader sense, how valuable is Terminator 2? That's a movie. If you want to look at this cinegraphically and just say that this is a larger way of stepping inside motion picture storytelling, that kind of escapism, so much the better.
Well, the larger picture is this thing. You mentioned at the very beginning that the intent for Disney was to create a place for the suburban family to go to the retirement suburbs. And so now, it doesn't seem like Disney is addressing the current society with something like this. I mean, what is the goal now of Disney? I mean, it's
I guess. Yeah, I guess. Of course, look, the Walt Disney Company is a publicly held American corporation, okay? By the way, it's one of the few remaining American corporations that's entirely owned by American shareholders, okay? You know, if what we're doing is wrong, you know, in a larger moral sense, you know, there's a lot of things that aren't working well in this world. One of the things that does work with out on your own in the evening or off with your children at Disneyland, one of the things that does work is Disneyland. It still works. Okay? Look, if you want to redefine fascism in Disneyland terms, you know, I mean, that's a stretch, but huh? Nah, we're just having fun. See? We're just having fun. In the end, we're just having fun, you know?
I'm making like millions of dollars off of all the other, you know.
Great! Great, I got a great answer to that. Architecture is fun, and why not make money from it, right? You know. There was another hand, yes?
Yeah.
Loud, so we can hear.
I guess my criticism is not scathing.
Ha!
Don't get me wrong, it sounds like a nice place to go. It sounds like it'd be fun. I just wonder if you can comment on the fact that I just wonder, you know, to what extent can somebody bring something of their own to Pleasure Island? It seems to me absolutely everything is provided for you. Where are you going to go, when you're going to do it, it's provided for you, and what you're going to see is already pre-planned in a way that you only see a film in one direction. You know, you can't go back to a film and, you know, view one part. It's all presented for you. So what you're in the business of doing is entertaining people. Well, that's fine, but is there any room for anyone entertaining themselves?
Well, it depends upon what the degrees of entertaining yourself include. I've always thought dancing, you know, with my beautiful wife, was a great form of entertainment, and so does she. So we're providing a place where that moment, you know, is enriched because we've created a physical dynamic where we're sharing that energy and that fun in a social setting where when we're far away from home, when we're on vacation, and we want to do something different from standing in line and going on a ride, which is very definitely a totally structured event that you can't mingle with and can't interfere with. The idea of this place is you can do some fairly simple things in a very sort of visually complex and rich place. Let me try something for a minute, okay? I heard somebody recently describe a community. Let's see if I can get to this note. Remember this quote, Craig? It's a place where you can have an accidental encounter with someone with whom you're acquainted. So, by that definition, Pleasure Island doesn't qualify as a community. But it's more of a community than an individual nightclub is in a foreign city. And it's less of a community than a real place. It's something in between. It is a theme park, okay? So, it's possible, it's just possible, and I kind of believe this, which is why I'm doing this and why I'm passionate about it. It's just possible that the places left over in cities and the places left over from the industrial era, from Fordism, which is a word I heard used over the weekend, down at the University of California at San Diego, that those places that are left over, that those nodal points in cities are no longer well enough organized to be safe, while cities are undergoing some rather violent transformation.
Do you think it's important, though, that this place, which kind of purports to be a community, do you think it's at all important that it doesn't act in the way a normal community does? It doesn't grow and change and metamorphosize like a community does. There's no possibility for evolution because it's all under the direct control of this sort of totalitarian Disney.
You're going on your experience with Disney right now, which is that Disneyland is pretty fixed. This place, you know, I was trying to show you just a little bit how it's already being transformed. In fact, the guy that runs the place called me up terrified that he was changing the Zephyr Rock and Rollerdrome. He eliminated the roller skating and put in pool tables, which to people who like to play pool made a lot of sense. And he changed the theme of that interior from something which was trying to be sort of quiet in its own sort of weird way. It was trying to be kind of quiet. And he transformed the inside of it to a surf club. He took the entire interior and he covered it up with fishnets and giant Japanese cork floats and huge stuffed sharks and things like that. And he called me up a little upset that maybe he had taken all the sarin and molded chairs out and he was putting in, surf furniture, chunks of surfboards, etc. And he said, God, I'm afraid I've messed this up. And I said, you haven't done enough. If you're going to go in and fool with it, then what you have to do is really change it. I wouldn't have put the shark inside. I would have made the entire gangway into a great white shark and really toyed with it and played with it. And in the end, that's what he started to do. He started to really transform all of the place. So the one thing about this particular project is it's changing all the time. So I don't know if that helps. Yes?
Disneyland was built on a show of mythical sort of white Anglo-Saxon mythology, and this island also seems to be similarly developed in American white Anglo-Saxon city. Is the Disney Imagineering part continuing that sort of same myth, and is it good for export? Is that why?
Well, you remember along the way before I showed slides and really got everybody impassioned, right? By saying it was real. Remember I talked about product, okay? So here is a set of disciplines, environmental design disciplines. They're component to a product, which is a larger idea. It's a bigger thing. So if the focus the product is taken can be defined in those terms, then yes, we're serving that ethos. In fact, what we're doing is creating components of a piece that's bigger than that. How the Disney parks are managed, how they're operated, how security is conveyed, whether or not they change, who the target audience is, how it's focused, how much money they intend to make, etc. Those are things that are certainly part of this idea and part of the programming that leads to how you craft the place architectonically, but reach way beyond my ability to sort of manage that and change that definition. So the best I can do is to introduce, cosmic jokes into the thing rather than, changing the idea of Disneyland. Right there.
Accept the concept of Disney placemaking, and given the fact that urban planners can't really plan cities anymore, what's the next thing? I mean, do you actually take Disney concept of placemaking and take over the larger things? What would Disney placemaking do for something that happened? Well, what about Long Beach?
I know. You asked me about Long Beach and asked me about Anaheim, and I don't know enough. It's a big company. I don't know enough about either of those projects. It's a cop-out to not answer that here. But to go back to the other piece of that question and layer it back in and help maybe explain the ideas for Long Beach and Anaheim. Disneyland and the theme parks are private places. They don't pretend to enter the public domain. They don't intend to. And although they may have had some influence over the years, I think the influence is undeniable in some shopping centers, some urban renewal projects. Disney is quintessentially a private place, and you pay admission to go in and experience these layers of production value. And we're not being dishonest about that. We're saying, you pay admission to come in and experience this for the course of a day. And we're not pretending in the way some urban renewal projects pretend that they've actually taken their place and they're in repose with the extant community. Isn't the sort of the core notion of a lot of urban renewal to move out the detrimental components of society that have rooted into cities that are in chaos?
I thought it was to make it a happy place.
Make it a happy place, yeah? I guess so, but
Well, if you're what I'm getting at is if you're playing with reality, what is a real experience, what isn't a real experience, it just seems to me that urban planning fails because maybe too real without happy enough.
You know, we've had, over the years, I've been at Disney for about 11 years. We have, over the years, had mayors and city councils from all over the country come to us and ask us to go into cities and sort of help them and fix cities and stuff like that. And you know, there's only so many Pirates of the Caribbean to go around, and we don't want to live in the Pirates of the Caribbean. So it's, you know, you sort of decline moving out into that world. What you do is you take from it for storytelling devices. You know, you use of it, you know, what you think will reinforce a story point. But I don't know if you can take the artificial constructs of Disneyland, you take that back out and insert it back into society. It's sort of like, you know, the representation of family life on television in the range of sitcoms that are on TV. Nobody lives this way, you know. So, you know, it's entertainment, pure and simple. And part of the entertainment happens to be some placemaking. Whether that placemaking has validity outside of the confines of a private industry, is way beyond me to philosophize about or to answer or to deal with. I'd like to move out of it from time to time, but I'm having too much fun where I am, you know. And I mean, it's a rude thing to say, but it's an easier place to be an artist architect, even if the nature of the art is influenced heavily by Disney icons and the whole Disney corporate atmosphere. It nevertheless, it's absolutely real to go and sit and argue for your project and argue the merits of your clients' entitlements with city councils and planning commissions and things like that. On the other hand, it's a hell of a lot of fun to have Craig come and visit me and to be swathed in a mountain of paper that deals only with one thing, with crafting place. That's selfish, but it's great fun, and I'm sort of here to tell you that doing this stuff is, mostly it's about having fun. Yes.
Do you use very many environmental behaviorists or environmental psychologists in discussing the way the place is being experienced in the creation process?
Not really. We go on our own sort of our own ideas and our own experience about what's fun, what's entertaining, what we can capture up from our own memories and our own life experiences. And we put it all together in a way that we think's going to be equally fun to others. It's boy, it's real middle class. But there's nothing wrong with it. Chevys are middle class too, and they still sell lots of them.
Yeah, you have the rare luxury of being involved in a continuing relationship with your project. And I was wondering, what has been the major maintenance headaches that have cropped up with this project as it's gone into working? And what you do differently than we're doing it now?
What, how to take care of this place?
Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest maintenance puzzle has been to maintain the software. The hardware of the place, the built place, the buildings, the furnishings, all of that business, that's pretty stout, I mean, since we used a factory vernacular in the material, there's a lot of steel and not a lot of plaster and wood, not a lot of things that can crumble and come apart. It's built hell for stout. What's delicate is the software. And whereas the software of a Disney show ride within a park is bulletproof because it's totally programmed and computer controlled. Matter of fact, the original very crude analog computers that operate the animation at the Pirates of the Caribbean are still there after 22 years. A fabulous system that involves light reading diodes, electric eyes, and big platters of aluminum that have the movements of each of the figures carved off of the edge. Well, at Pleasure Island we don't have that because the idea is that because it's nightclub as theater, every night there's not a programmed set of events that occur. There's performance taking place from disc jockeys and sound booths and lighting and theatrical rigging experts, etc., they're crafting the event, and they're trying to feel the energy of the audience every night. The software glitch in all of that is that those guys don't want to work so hard. It's natural. They want to put it on automatic and kick back. And, you know, I've seen that big nightclub, the Mannequins, with 800 or 900 people on that dance floor. The whole place just grind to a halt when a guy cues the wrong lighting sequence, the wrong, for that audience and for where they're headed and what energy level they've built up from the disco side. Seen that whole thing just implode and literally the club empty. So that's the thing that's hard to maintain, is the software. The other part of the software that's hard to maintain is to keep it fresh and to keep it sort of more tuned up to, you know, this week's trend. And the other thing in maintenance, if you will, is to get them to use everything that's there. The big problem with the project right from the start was they didn't run a party in the street. They didn't have dancing in the streets. They didn't have events occurring in the streets. They didn't have any merchandise in the streets. The whole place was designed so that all the energy from the clubs flowed out and filled up the streets. For about 6 months, they had individual doormen dressed in tuxedos checking IDs, so the clubs were empty. And since they're nightclubs, they're not much fun if they're not filled with people. The fun of a nightclub is that dynamic of a big audience.
Where do you pay cover?
You pay cover at the bridge. There's a toll booth on the bridge.
Once you're in, you're in.
Once you're in, you're in. So if you get bored at one of the clubs, you just bounce out into the street and go to the next one.
How do we get a fun job like yours?
Huh? Don't be too critical of corporate America, right? Go with it, you know? You just go with it. You know, it was pretty easy. Yes?
I thought one of the most interesting things that you talked about was that how Disney had a picture of the American family and how he designed the whole place. Oh my God. How he designed a place that was basically built around the vision of the American white family, where there was the mother, the father, and the kids, and how everything was designed for that purpose, and how his vision of America created a place that kind of created his vision of America in exchange. But what I'm wondering is, now that vision of America is pretty obsolete. What is your new vision of America, and how does your design incorporate it? And you're talking a little bit about how, like, the townies would mingle with the vacationers, and how there was like that design contest in there. Like, what does that say about your picture of the townies?
That's good. That's a good one. Let me think. That's a reach. Well, as should be readily apparent, you know, whatever personal vision I have of all of that, you know, is closed down, you know, looking through a pretty narrow aperture. Because I've sort of settled on how I can fit things to changes that are on the way. Now, over the weekend in a series of lectures, there's a lot of discussion about the information city and about community being transformed via network upon network of computer relationships, so that no longer were communities structured in the classic sense of the history of city making, but that cities that no longer were limited by geography are beginning to emerge as the computer networks begin to interlayer with each other, and that you can now craft a place for yourself, an identity, within computer networks, and no longer have to engage face-to-face in thorny discussions such as, why should Disney make so much money? Is abortion right or wrong? All kinds of thorny political topics and things like that, which are so volatile that they are difficult to discuss in an open setting, are now taking place in these networks. These networks were actually defined as emerging communities. My problem with that, not a problem, but that's fine, that's a form of community perhaps. The myopic, or the little vista that I have of the whole thing says, that just says that there's that much more need for more theme parks. Because the theme parks are now going to replace the transformed face-to-face society, and say I wrote some stuff down. I said, how in a computer network, when you put up your identity and stuff like that, how do you attach to that body language, personality, willfulness, your appearance, how you dress, how you want to move about, who you want to talk to, etc. How do you protect your privacy, and how do you reveal your ideas and your thoughts? So I'm sort of stuck thinking that the more we move towards the information city and the information society, the more that technology inexorably reinvents us as a world, let alone as a nation or a community or a village, that all that does is tell me I got lots of theme parks to build. Because I can make theme parks using stuff we've already done as ways to produce structure. That we can make some more theme parks that are even more attenuated and even more specifically focused to isolated topics. The reason I showed you this one tonight is that the meaning of this park is pretty narrow. It's about going out at night as grown-ups and dancing and being entertained by theatrical performers. It's a night on the town when you're a long way from home. So I got a feeling maybe a night on the town nearby home that is a little more controlled, a little more contained, a little safer, unfortunately, might be an enclave that we don't want to admit is necessary or important, but actually is probably going to wind up happening. So I fully intend to be there to build those, If somehow they move out and help other things, great, that's a byproduct. Well, look, two things here. One, we can sit off in a corner unofficially and argue some of the points, which have to do with definitions of a character, of an individual's character, the underlying meanings or whatever. On the other hand, be very out front and say two things. One, if I know what the next ones are, if they're not yet made, I'm not going to tell you about them because we're competitive as an organization. And two, there's the other old thing about if it's not broken, don't fix it. And there are some aspects about Disneyland, regardless of what deeper definitions individuals want to place on it or whole groups want to place on it, there are some things about Disneyland that work, even if it was designed for the all-American family. There's still such a thing as the all-American family, and they still need places to go. I still need a place to take my 22-year-old, my 9-year-old, and my 1-year-old, where I can turn them loose together and know that in the course of the day, they'll be safe. I don't have to worry. They can have a taste of freedom. They can explore edges of things that are not available to them either at home or in an automobile or on television. And we can come back and we now have a shared experience that we can gather up and talk about and spend time with. I mean, that's pretty simple,
You can take them all to the library.
Yeah, I guess you could take them all to the library too. But wait a minute. See, there's something right there, okay? Before movable print was invented, there was no such thing as a library. There was another institution, and the institution was the church. And the way the church told stories was through the architecture, and the Gothic architecture that had all of the imagery conveyed into the ornament was telling stories that came from Scripture. And that was just as powerful a system and just as powerful a medium, absent anything to replace it, as perhaps, in a very small way, Disneyland is today, or was in 1955. Stick with the bookmobile, sure. Movable print, okay. You ever seen a Touchstone movie? Okay.
Are condoms available on site?
Well, see, I've been in a 23-year, singular relationship, so I haven't a clue as to whether or not I can find those things there. I don't know. They should be. If they're not, it would astound me.
I think it's time.
Enough. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you very much.